All right, today is Friday, November 22nd. Xavier is coming off an 80-55 win over Siena on Wednesday night, and they'll head to Florida over the weekend for the Fort Myers tip-off starting on Monday night at 8:30 p.m. when they take on South Carolina in their first game away from the Cintas Center. Paul Fritschner is going to join me in just a minute to touch on something from the Xavier-Siena game. As I mentioned, an 80-55 win for Xavier. Not a lot to talk about with this one. Just a few things to recap here. Ryan Conwell had 16 points to lead the Musketeers. He was 4 of 5 from three-point range. Trey Green came off the bench in just 17 minutes, knocked down 4 threes. He was 5 of 8 from the field, 4 of 7 from beyond the arc, had 14 points, 3 rebounds, 3 assists in just his 17 minutes of action. And Marcus Foster was another guy who I thought stood out in this one, had 12 points, 5 of 7 from the field, 2 of 2 from beyond the arc, 5 rebounds, 5 assists in his night. Xavier shot well from three again, 45.8% from beyond the arc, 11 of 24 from deep. And, I thought that was kind of it. Like it was just going to be a ho-hum game from that point. That's really, we were just going to talk about Xavier shooting well again, getting another easy win over a bye opponent and getting prepared to take on South Carolina. But then we went into the media room after the game and we talked to Sean Miller, and he felt a bit differently about how the game went. And so we'll listen to his comments here. These were part of his comments, at least.
When we go to Florida, we have to have more defined roles in the 8-9 guys we're going to play. And if you don't play with all of your heart and soul for Xavier University on defense, you are not playing. You are not playing. You will not see that guy check in. He will not play. And I think that's the standard, and that's where we have to see this thing through. It'll be interesting to see how we go from here. That's for sure.
All right, so those were the comments from Sean Miller after the game. Those were part of his comments, at least. Those are the ones that seemed to be more directed at his team. At the beginning of the press conference, he kind of opened it up by talking about how he didn't feel there was any energy in the building, didn't feel like there was any energy from his team, and he wasn't happy with the way that the game went. So kind of interesting, given that it was an 80-55 game, didn't seem like there was a ton going on. To hear him be so exasperated in the post-game press conference kind of stood out. And then to hear those really pointed words after the game was notable, I thought. And, when you think about who he was talking about here, it wasn't the starters. He kind of made that clear that he was more so aiming that towards his bench. And he also complimented Jerome Hunter. So I don't think that's who he was talking about from the bench. So that means you're left with Trey Green, Dante Maddox, and John Hughley, essentially. I already mentioned Trey Green had 14 points. He was 5 of 8 from the field, 4 of 7 from beyond the arc, 3 rebounds, 3 assists in 17 minutes of play. So it was one of his better games. Now, that being said, Sean Miller made it a point in some of his other comments to say that, the issue for the team right now is guys are worried about scoring points. They want to win, but they want to win and score, and they're not worried more about buying into their role and whatever that is on this team. And so, again, I think overall it's probably directed mostly at Trey Green and Dante Maddox. Maybe John Hughley's included in there a little bit, but probably mostly those two guards that are kind of battling it out for those backup minutes right now. Both of those guys are more offensive-minded players. They're more scorers and shooters. And so them sort of coming in and trying to play that role, but not doing some of the other smaller things defensively. They've been pretty good about taking care of the basketball. I think the entire team has been good at that. But really, I think most of it boils down to defense. He really got on Dante Maddox, Sean Miller, really got on Dante Maddox coming into one of the timeouts early in the second half. And it happened after he had taken a long three from the top of the key. It was deep, several feet from beyond the arc at the top of the key. And then he missed it. And then on the defensive end, he gave up a quick three on the other end to Reed Ducharme. And right after that, Xavier came down, hit a three on their end. I think it was Conwell. Sean called a timeout, and then he really got on Dante coming into that timeout. And I don't say that to single Dante out, but just trying to get down to what he was talking about here, where these comments were coming from Sean Miller after the game. You'd have to think that's kind of where he was going with that. So from a holistic standpoint, talking to the entire team, I think it's trying to get a complete 40-minute effort out of them. From which individual is this mostly aimed at in terms of you're not going to see minutes if you don't figure out your role. I think on this specific night, it was probably mostly aimed at Dante Maddox. But again, I think it's kind of a combination of those two backup guards off of the bench more than anything, Trey Green and Dante Maddox. They kind of fight their way 4 minutes here. All right, I'm going to bring in Paul Fritschner now to talk about the comments from Sean Miller after the game. Paul, I was just talking about how it was an 80-55 win for Xavier. I'm thinking, I'm kind of writing my lead about how they shot the ball well again. They had a bunch of transition points, kind of a ho-hum game as they complete this bye game portion of their non-conference schedule and get ready to play away from Cintas Center for the first time in the Fort Myers tip-off. And then we go into the press conference and we hear from Sean Miller, and I was like, okay, wasn't quite expecting that reaction from the head coach after that performance. What was your takeaway after hearing Sean Miller's comments?
It did feel like a choppy game, right? It felt like Xavier was always comfortably in front, but they weren't playing their A-plus game. And so that's where you get into the post-game presser and you're thinking to yourself, all right, Xavier's 5-0. They've passed their one high major test this year. They've played 4 bye games. They've looked really good in 2 games. They've looked pretty good in the other game last night, and they looked not so good in their first 2 games. So what kind of tone are you going to set? And I think there was a vast majority of this that I got the feeling like he was genuinely upset. He was doing his best to make the point that you can't go out there and just hunt shots against high major teams. And that's where I'm kind of coming from with this, that, hey, things are about to get real. Things are about to get to a point where you're not playing Jackson State. You're not playing Siena every night. South Carolina might not be great. Virginia Tech might be off to a bad start. But these are not pushovers. These are not teams that are 300th in the country. These are top 100 teams that are going to give you a great game if you guys aren't playing your best game. And I think it was a wake-up call that these guys needed to say, hey, if you're coming at it from that perspective and you think you're just going to walk over these teams because you're shooting the ball well, you have to put together a full effort on both ends of the court, or else that's not going to happen. And I think he needed to communicate that before Monday, where now you have 3 or 4 days to clean things up.
Yeah, I would also say it feels like a good sign for the team that Sean Miller is taking the opportunity after an 80-55 win to get mad at them and maybe almost even nitpick to some extent here. I mean, it was pretty pointed. It seemed to be at least to potentially one guy in this game, maybe a couple of guys off of the bench there, because he said it wasn't aimed at the starters, and he said Jerome Hunter played well. So that only leaves really 3 guys that played in the game after that. And I don't really think he was talking too much about John Hughley, although you could certainly ask for more out of the big fella too. So again, it seems like it's kind of these 2 guards off the bench who are very offensive minded, 3-point shooters. They're battling it out. They want to outscore each other because they feel like they have to make the most out of their opportunity. I think his message to them is, hey, we need you to be really good players for Xavier that help contribute to winning whenever you get your chance. That's what's going to keep you on the floor and getting those extra opportunities and those extra minutes over each other. It's not going to be the fact that you came in and you hit a few extra threes, even though obviously both of them can change a game with their ability to shoot the 3. And you saw it with Trey Green, right? Him shooting the 3 against the 2-3 zone against Siena definitely impacted that game in a hurry. It's like, that's the impact he and Dante Maddox can have on these games, but they do have to be more solid and more reliable in other areas.
Yeah, fully agree there. I really don't even have anything to add. I think you're spot on. I just think the fact that now you're turning to a much more difficult portion of your schedule. Yeah, you have one bye game mixed in there in between Fort Myers and TCU, but then it's the shootout and you get into Big East play and everything else that, hey, you had these 5 games. We understand what you guys can do offensively, but to be the best that we can be, to be a complete team, you have to give us something on the defensive end to where we can keep you on the court, because that's what's going to separate. I mean, you think about Trey Green and some of the struggles he's had. For as well as he plays offensively, there are just quite literally times where he is not big enough to stay on the court. But depending on the lineup, some of the other players that Xavier has can mask some of those issues depending on who Trey Green is in the game with. Dante Maddox, much bigger, much more physical, but if he's not giving you that same effort and intensity on defense, then you can't leave him out there as long. Then you have to go back to Trey, and things, it's that seesaw that maybe you're trying to avoid. So I do understand where both of them are coming from, because it's quickly shown that, like you said, Rick, they're competing for the same minutes essentially. But to me, they do have slightly different roles just because of their size and physicality. And Trey, the range that Trey has, I mean, his ability to shoot the ball, not saying that Dante isn't a great shooter, but Trey can just come in and immediately he can make 3 threes in 4 minutes, check right back out of the game, and the stat line will look great. So yeah, I think to wrap up the thought on that press conference, I think it was just, hey, you guys need to make sure you're locked in before this season really gets underway here.
I was mentioning the part of the game where Sean Miller really seemed to hit his boiling point was somewhere around like the 17-minute mark of the second half, where Dante missed a deep three from the top of the key. Then down on the other end, he gives up a three to Reed Ducharme. And then Xavier comes down and hits a three, and he calls a quick timeout and kind of chews Dante out coming into the timeout. How do you think there's any part of that made him a little bit more mad that it was a former Xavier transfer out that had hit the three? Like, it's like, you can't let that guy do it to you, man. If you're playing like you're being a little soft defensively, you're not on it, you're not sharp defensively, it's one thing. You can't let the guy who just transferred out hit the three on us when you're doing it, right?
I mean, it has to, right? That has to have played into it.
I had to burn him up a little bit.
It has to have.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that after the fact. I was like, man, that's aside from that, Paul, real quick while I have you here, I know you're running around making a documentary and everything, so I appreciate you checking in. Separate from that, there's not a lot else that I saw to talk about this game. One thing that I was slightly disappointed in is that we didn't get more from John Hughley, because this was a team that didn't have anyone bigger than 6'8", 220 pounds. When he got in the game, he could clearly move bodies with his mass, but he wasn't really effective, wasn't able to stay on the court for more than 13 minutes, had just 4 points, was 2 of 4 from the field and 2 rebounds. You piggyback off of that or anything else that you took away from this game?
John Hughley's play was the only other thing from the Siena game, because look, Ryan Conwell, I mean, Sean, I think it sounded like wanted a little bit more out of Ryan on both ends, but he still shot the ball exceptionally well after the game. I thought it was funny because where I thought Ryan didn't play all that well on Saturday, Sean came in and said he played great. And then where it looked like Ryan played fantastic on Tuesday, Sean said he would have liked a little bit more out of him. So it's just, some of it again is like, I wonder how much of it is just keeping these guys on track and the mind games and making sure they're locked in. There's definitely an element of that.
Yeah.
There's definitely a coaching element of that, but I did kind of get a little bit of a kick out of that. But yeah, Hughley was the only other thing, just because, you see the size listed in numbers, you might be able to watch film, but until, I'm standing there right next to the starting lineup and you look and you see, and my very first thought looking at the starting lineup as they were being introduced at Cintas was, oh my God, these guys are tiny. And I was standing there and I was thinking, please let this be a game where John Hughley can make a massive difference in this game, or at least build up a little confidence going down to Florida where you're going to be tested a little more. And didn't really do that. So now you kind of do start to wonder. I mean, we talk so much about Lucina Traore's injury and what Xavier is going to have to do to replace that. And you kind of do wonder now if the front court's going to have issues all season.
Yeah. And at the same time, like the one high major test they've had with big front court guys, they passed with flying colors. I mean, they were totally fine in that game. And South Carolina is going, I don't think South Carolina is playing really well right now. We saw that against Mercer on Thursday night. They didn't fare too well in that game, although they did pull it out eventually. And they obviously have a bye game loss already to North Florida. They lost to Indiana. So I don't think they're the best team right now. But that being said, they do have a front court that is physical, that can score a little bit, that can definitely rebound. So Xavier's front court is going to be challenged in this first game down in Florida, and they're going to need something out of John Hughley. So it's another opportunity. And I'll say, I'm almost liable to say, if they have no issues with South Carolina's front court, not that they're world beaters, but they are solid and they can do some things. If there's no issue there, at some point we just have to say, like, maybe the front court defense isn't going to be the issue we thought it was, right? Like maybe this team is going to be able to rebound and defend in the front court, even without Siena Traore. I don't actually think that's the case, but at some point they actually have to have issues with it for us to keep talking about how big of a concern it is, I guess, you know?
Yeah, true. Yeah. Okay.
All right, Paul. Just in terms of expectations, I know we kind of talked about it. It feels like Xavier should probably win this thing down in Florida now, right? Like they look like the best team right now.
They do. We talked about it before the season. And again, I go back to exactly what I said on the podcast earlier this week, where I mentioned that I picked them to go 1-1 because you just felt like it's somewhere they were probably going to slip up. But now after seeing what South Carolina's done, Virginia Tech looks horrific. Now they may not play Virginia Tech unless Virginia Tech upsets Michigan, in which case maybe Virginia Tech kind of rights the ship a little bit, but that would kind of be where that's telling you. But a loss to South Carolina would be a tough loss. And then you would probably get Michigan there. I think Xavier's a better team than Michigan, at least from what I've seen here early on out of Michigan. So
Michigan lost to Wake Forest.
Yeah, exactly. So, looking at it from that perspective, I mean, and I don't think Wake Forest even played particularly well in that game from what I remember of watching that game.
We've seen Wake Forest, and I don't get the sense that they're a team that has it all figured out right now.
Yeah. They won that. I think it was 72-70. It was a close game, and Michigan couldn't even win that thing. So I know it's weird in the sense of you play away from home for the first time, and it's just sometimes things are weird in tournaments like this where you go down to Florida, the crowds are different. I will say, though, I think Xavier's expecting a pretty good crowd from what I've heard. I think the allotment for Xavier tickets is sold out. I've heard a ton of people are going down there. So it should be a pretty good Xavier crowd, and it's a very small arena. So if Xavier does have a good crowd, that'll certainly help. I don't know how much Michigan and how much South Carolina and Virginia Tech are bringing to the table as far as fans go. So that might be a little bonus.
At least for two of those schools, they're still pretty worried about football season.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean. That's what I mean. And so I just, from that perspective, Rick, like if I would expect Xavier to go 2-0 in this tournament.
Yeah, it's feeling that way. It's feeling almost like they should. You hate to say that when it comes to these exempt events because things always are weird and you're playing other high major opponents, but it does feel like they are clearly the best team here all of a sudden. So,
Yep.
All right, Paul, I'll let you get back to it. Thank you for checking in. I appreciate your time.
Appreciate it. See y'all from Florida. If anybody's listening to this, Adam and I and Josh will be down there. So if you see us, say hey.
Enjoy your trip.
Thanks.
All right. That's Paul Fritschner. Appreciate him talking a little bit about those post-game comments from Sean Miller. And it was just kind of a strange deal there in the press conference. We all sort of looked around at each other after Sean's comments like, whoa, wasn't quite expecting that. But again, part of it is a little bit of that mental game, right? Just trying to keep these guys hungry, keep these guys sharp, and realize they haven't accomplished anything yet, even though they are sitting here undefeated. All right, well, I think that's all there is to talk about for the Siena game and the lead up here to South Carolina from a Xavier perspective. But I do want to give you guys more of a South Carolina perspective on things. So I have a guest in to talk about that. And joining me now to talk about this South Carolina team is John Whittle from our South Carolina 24/7 site. John, first of all, thank you for taking the time out to do this. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Always happy to talk a little basketball with you, Rick.
Yeah, so a big matchup coming here to start the Fort Myers tip-off. Xavier and South Carolina facing off in the first round. And both of these teams have already had some tests. South Carolina's faced Indiana. They also have another loss to North Florida in a bye game. And then Xavier has beaten Wake Forest now. But this is going to provide another strong gauge for both teams to kind of see where they're at. This South Carolina team is coming off a 26-8 season last year where they earned a 6th seed in the tournament. They're picked to finish 11th out of 16 in the SEC. They're currently 3-2. They have wins over South Carolina State, Towson, and Mercer, their most recent win just on Thursday night. And then I mentioned the losses to North Florida and Indiana. So What would be kind of the big picture storyline for this group? Is it a group that's taking some time to find its chemistry? Are there some major flaws that have been exposed early here, or where would you say they're at?
Yeah, different team, different style is basically what it has come down to. You know, South Carolina did bring back a few really key pieces from last year's team, but have a lot of new guys too, and you know, lost kind of some of your stabilizing forces out there. You lost Talon Cooper, who was up at Minnesota for a couple of years, and then transferred back home to South Carolina. Ran the show really well at point guard, and he was kind of a bigger guy. Just he just plays differently than South Carolina's point guard this year, Jamari Thomas, and you know that alone right there just kind of changes the dynamic of your team and kind of the style of your. And you know, South Carolina's kind of adjusting to that a little bit. And you know, you lose BJ Mack, who was a below the rim center, but could hit the three, and you bring in Nick Pringle, who's a 6'10", 6'11", you know, twitchy, athletic guy who blocks shots and you know doesn't have much of a shot. So you've got your point guard and your center who are just drastically different from the style of last year's team. So you're just kind of trying to put it all together right now. And you know, it's gone okay at points. And, you know, obviously a loss to North Florida is a bad deal to open the season, probably a quad 4 loss. So, you know, this team is still trying to find its way a little bit.
Let's talk a little bit more about some of the individuals on this team. Colin Murray Boyles was a third-team preseason All-SEC selection. He's averaging about 16 points and 10 rebounds per game. Describe his game. What's he really do well?
Well, and that's evolving a little bit from last year too, right? Like he's longer than he is tall. So he's probably 6'7", maybe 6'8" on a good day. Really long arms, you know, quick around the rim, scores well around the rim. But this year he's working on the outside shot a little bit. You wouldn't know it by the first 5 games because he hadn't attempted many. Now against Mercer in the last game, he took 2 3-pointers and, you know, swished them both. Looked like a natural out there. So his game is kind of evolving a little bit. Like he's a potential draft pick after this season. You know, potentially comes back for a junior year, but you know, there's some folks out there who think he can work his way even into the first round after this season. So, you know, he's been South Carolina's best player. When he's been out there over the last 2 years. He missed the first half of the season or early last season with mono and you know, he's disappeared in a couple of big games. So including this year against Indiana and a couple down the stretch last year. So, you know, it's a little bit different with him. You know, you want to see a little bit more in big moments and in big games, but he's got some of the tools that, you know, he's one of the big reasons that there have been a ton of NBA scouts coming through the doors at South Carolina, which isn't always the case around here.
You were talking a little bit about the guard play in your opening answer there, specifically point guard play, but they have 2 guards who are kind of the scoring guards for this backcourt, leading the way here in double digits. Jacoby Wright's averaging 13.5 points per game, shooting 39% from deep. And then Jamari Thomas averaging 11.3 points per game. How did they kind of work in tandem together? What's their MO there in the backcourt?
Yeah, they're both kind of smaller guards, you know, 6 foot, 6'1", but they're playing okay off of each other right now. Jacoby didn't start the year as a starter. He was a 6-man last year and was in that role to begin the year. This year they went with a little bit of a bigger lineup to start out, but you know, Jacoby was just playing too well and shooting too well, and you know, South Carolina was getting off to bad starts in the first half and second half of each of the first few games, to include the exhibition, and you know, they just really needed to change something with the starting lineup. So those guys are playing okay off of each other. Jacoby began his career at South Carolina more of an on-ball role. And in the last couple of years has been more of a shooting guard, but you know, he's been able to run the point a little bit too, pretty effectively. And you know, South Carolina tries to play a little bit of positionless ball, so it doesn't matter too much, you know, where you are. But I think they've done okay so far. Jacoby didn't have a great game against Indiana and was only okay against Mercer. So, you know, It's still a little bit to be determined. It wouldn't surprise me a bit if there's a little bit more evolution from South Carolina from a guard standpoint in terms of minutes and roles.
How do they get their points?
Whew. Well, it's been a little bit different this year too. South Carolina had 4 guys in double figures against Mercer, and that was certainly a welcome deal. There's not one main scorer. There's not really two main. Murray Boyles can go off. There are a couple of shooters on this team. Miles Studi, he hadn't had one of those games yet, but he can go off. But it's very balanced. It's very balanced in terms of individuals. Now, one thing that's different from last year, talked earlier about kind of changing in styles, like South Carolina's already got more double-digit games where they've scored double-digit transition points than they had all of last year. So, they're playing a little bit faster. Last year's team was very methodical, very defense-oriented. They were one of the I think finished second, either first or second in the SEC last year, and points per game allowed. And part of that was because they played pretty slow, but part of that was very good defensively. This year, South Carolina's got 3 80-point games so far, and it took them until conference play last year to hit that mark. So it's a little bit of a different team in terms of style, in terms of how they're scoring, but they're also not playing the same way defensively either. They've already given up 70 as many times this year through 5 games as they did all the way up until the start of conference play too. So it's just different style, different team.
What about those 2 guards specifically? Both of them are in double figures there. Is Wright more of a shooter and Thomas more the driver? Is that a good way to look at it, or how would you describe them on offense?
Honestly, both of them have been more shooters than scorers at the rim. Both of them, and it's funny. I was thinking during the Mercer game, like, both of these guys get their shots swatted at the rim way too often. Jamari scores a little bit better at the rim than Jacoby does, but both of them are more shooters than drivers. Jamari likes to try to get into the lane. He does a better job of passing out of that versus scoring out of that, because he's just a smaller guy, and I don't think he's figured out quite yet how to against some of these bigger guys, notably against Indiana, which has a tremendous, as you guys know, obviously front court, and he just gets his shot blocked. But he's transitioning from the MEAC, and it's just different ball at that level. And I wouldn't classify either one of those guys as tremendous at scoring at the rim. Both of them I would classify more as shooters than penetrators, and penetrators to score at least.
Yeah. You talked about Nick Pringle, the starting center. He's averaging about 9.8 points per game and 8 rebounds. He's physical when I watch him. He gets off the floor quickly, has really long arms. He can block some shots and protect the rim on defense. What else does he do that really stands out?
I mean, those are the main things, to be honest with you. I mean, there have been times where he does go in there and plays physically, both from a defensive standpoint and from a rebounding standpoint. But he hasn't been much of an offensive guy throughout his career. He started his career at Alabama. This is his last year here, and he's playing it at South. But he was never asked to score at Alabama. He was asked to play defense and dunk. And, now he's being asked to do a little bit more, and that's gone okay at times. But he's also gotten the ball taken away from him around the basket a little bit at times too.
Just to be clear, is the dog a fan of Nick Pringle or against Nick Pringle? It's one or the other, but I couldn't quite make it out there.
I think they're both fans of Nick Pringle. I don't think they're fans of whoever's walking out in front of the out in front of the house right now.
That darn mailman again. Every day he comes by that way. Give me one other name. Is it Studi? Like who haven't I hit on that I should have mentioned here? Give me another name that fans should keep an eye on.
I would say Zach Davis. He's started some of the games this year. I think all the games this year. but he's probably the guy. He's worked really hard on his shot and trying to improve his shot this off season. And you saw glimpses of it going in against Mercer. He hadn't really hit on too much just yet, but he's long. And he can play. I think you may see a little bit more 1-3-1 from this team going forward. I don't know that for sure, but I think you're going to see a little bit more 1-3-1. And he's a big 6'7" guy who can play that guard spot and be out there at the top and cut off some passing lanes. So I think that he's somebody to watch. He's probably South Carolina's best on ball defender. Especially when he's engaged. There are times when he, I think, kind of loses focus a little bit, but he's somebody who can make an impact on the court on both ends if the day is right. He's got a tremendous like skill set in terms of tools, but doesn't always put it together. He's still trying to find his way a little bit, even in his junior year.
You mentioned 1-3-1 there. Now, typically they're a really hard-nosed, half-court man-to-man, tough in the gaps, really take away dribble penetration. Don't give up any 2-point field goals. That's kind of the MO of their defense. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and that's what it was last year, and that's what it is in general. But they want to be a little bit more versatile this year as well, and they want to pick up full court a little bit more than what they've done in the past. And Jamari is part of that. But they want to be a little bit more versatile. At least that's what I was told and coming into this season, and haven't seen a whole heck of a lot of that just yet. Saw a little bit of the 1-3-1 against Mercer, and saw it a little bit at the end of the season last season, but saw it a little bit against Mercer, and it just didn't work quite right. I think they're going to try to. I think they're going to try to show a little bit more in the games coming up, but we'll see on that. But your characterization of South Carolina's defense in general is definitely correct.
What type of team do you think would give this South Carolina team the most trouble? Is there a weakness, or is there an area you can pick on them a little bit?
Well, this team hasn't been as good defensively yet as usual. To me, they've been a little bit late on rotations. They haven't been as tough defensively in terms of guarding the ball in a lot of instances. I think Jamari Thomas has played with great effort on that end. I don't feel like they've played quite as physically down low as they should have. Mercer was out rebounding them for most of the game on this past Thursday, and North Florida, I believe, ended up out rebounding them in the opening game of the season. I just don't think that they are playing with quite the physicality, quite the toughness, quite the confidence that last year's team did. And, maybe that evolves over the course of the season, but that's something that's a little bit worrisome at this point.
Full disclosure, we're recording this the morning after South Carolina played Mercer. So I imagine you probably haven't done much prep work or preview on the tournament ahead for the Fort Myers tip-off. But are there any type of expectations or predictions for South Carolina heading down there?
Yeah, they would never say this, publicly, but I think if you go down there and win one of these two games, I think you're okay if you're South Carolina. Like, Xavier's really, really good. And so are the other teams that are down there. It's going to be difficult for South Carolina the way they're playing right now. From what we've seen the first 5 games, for them to go down there and win 2, that's just the size of it at this point. But they're also playing well below their ceiling right now, and they finally started knocking down some jump shots against Mercer. South Carolina ended up being, 7 of 13 from behind the 3-point line in the second half against Mercer on Thursday night. And that was certainly much better than, what they have been doing. And I think there's a lot more meat left on the bone for the Gamecocks. Obviously there is for every team right now, just, not even a few weeks into the season, but, South Carolina's not close to clicking on all cylinders. And, for me, I think part of it is just kind of continuing to up the effort level and finding some of the right combinations, because South Carolina, Lamont Paris, he likes to rotate his players. He'll play 10 guys a game, and play a lot of guys double-digit minutes, and I think he's trying to still find some of the things that click really well, and I think he's landed on a few, and I think he's landed on a few that just haven't. So I think there's a lot more for South Carolina to do, and if you can go down there and win one from this field, I think South Carolina's probably pretty happy.
Well, it should be good. I'm looking forward to watching this matchup and watching the tournament in general. John, I really appreciate you doing this. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely appreciate you, Rick. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you can find John's coverage on our South Carolina 24/7 site all season long. Thanks again, John. All right. Appreciate John Whittle joining me there to talk South Carolina. And, of course, Paul Fritschner earlier in the show joining us to talk some about the Musketeers from his car. And I appreciate all of you tuning in to listen to this edition of the Musketeer Report podcast. If you're making the trip to Florida, enjoy that. If you're watching from home, enjoy not only this game, but all of the games that are to come during Feast Week. And we'll talk all about that on the message board.